She had one chance to escape. It's 1324. Marjorie Kemp is 20 years old. Her father has arranged her marriage to a wealthy merchant. The wedding is in 3 days. But Marjorie doesn't want to marry. She wants to live independently, dedicate her life to religious study, remain unmarried. So she does something that medieval society says is impossible. She says no. What happens next will determine whether she lives or dies. Because here's what they don't tell you about medieval history: refusing marriage wasn't just socially unacceptable. In most of medieval Europe, it was legally impossible. A woman who said, "I don't want to marry," faced 3 options. Option 1, enter a convent. Become a nun. Live under strict religious rules, give up all your property to the church, never leave the monastery walls again. Option 2, be declared legally insane. Placed under permanent guardianship. Lose all rights to property, movement, and decision-making. Become a legal child for the rest of your life. Option 3, the punishment system. And option 3 is where most women who refused marriage ended up. The system had a name: femina sola, the solitary woman. The unmarried woman. The woman without a man. Medieval legal codes across Europe contain specific punishments for women who refuse to marry. Not guidelines. Not suggestions. Actual legal penalties enforced by courts, recorded in official documents, systematically applied for centuries. These weren't exceptional cases. This was policy. And the punishments were designed to break you. Financially, socially, legally, and eventually physically. Because medieval society needed women to marry. Marriage wasn't personal, it was economic infrastructure. Political alliances. Property transfer. Social control. A woman who refused to marry was refusing to participate in the system. And the system had ways of forcing participation. But here's what makes this story different: some women still refused. They found loopholes. They created strategies. They built networks. They survived. And their stories, preserved in court records, economic documents, church investigations, and occasionally their own writings, reveal something extraordinary. The battle between women who wanted autonomy and a society determined to deny it. The strategies women used to resist. The punishments they endured. And the few who won. If you want the medieval history they don't teach because it reveals too much about how society controls women, subscribe. This channel exists to expose the mechanisms of power through the people who resisted them. Let me show you what happened to women who refused to marry in the Middle Ages. The legal traps they faced. The economic weapons used against them. The social punishment system. And the remarkable ways some women beat it anyway. This is the story of the women who said no. And what that cost them. First, you need to understand why medieval society made marriage essentially mandatory for women. It wasn't about morality. It wasn't about religion. It was about control. The economic system. Medieval property law was designed around marriage. Here's how it worked. A woman couldn't own property in her own name, it had to be held through a male guardian, father, husband, brother, or designated male relative. When she married, all her property transferred to her husband. Not shared with him. Transferred. It became his. If she refused to marry, the property stayed with her father or male guardian indefinitely. Now imagine you're a medieval father with 3 daughters. If they all refuse to marry, your estate can't be divided among their husbands. No political alliances formed through their marriages. Your family's wealth doesn't expand through their dowries. Your daughters remain your financial responsibility forever. One daughter refusing to marry is a problem. Multiple daughters refusing is an economic disaster. That's why families, churches, and governments all had incentive to force marriage. The political system. Noble marriages were political treaties. Breaking a marriage arrangement meant breaking a political alliance. In 1302, Isabella of France was betrothed to Edward II of England at age 7. The alliance between France and England depended on this marriage. At age 12, Isabella tried to refuse the marriage. Her attempt lasted exactly 3 days before she was declared, in rebellion against both kingdoms, and forced into a carriage to England under armed guard. She was 12. Refusing marriage was treated as treason. The legal system. Here's the part that shocks people: medieval law defined adult legal status through marriage. An unmarried woman over 25 was legally classified as filia familias, daughter of the family, permanently under father's authority. Vidua, widow, only if previously married. Femina sola, solitary woman, a legal category with severely restricted rights. Only widows had legal independence. Never married women were perpetual legal minors. That means a 40-year-old unmarried woman had the same legal rights as a 10-year-old child. She couldn't make contracts, appear in court without a male guardian, own property independently, choose her residence, travel without permission, make a will, unless she married. Marriage granted adult legal status. Refusing marriage meant refusing legal adulthood. So what happened to women who still refused? First came the financial pressure. And it was systematic. Weapon 1, the dowry confiscation. When a woman reached marriageable age, typically 14 to 16, her family began accumulating her dowry, the property and wealth she'd bring to marriage. If she refused to marry, many regions had laws allowing the family to confiscate that dowry and redistribute it to siblings. Court records from 14th-century Florence show dozens of cases where unmarried women sued their families for dowry theft. They almost never won. The legal reasoning: a woman who refuses her natural purpose forfeits her claim to family resources. Natural purpose. Refusing marriage was denying your nature. Weapon 2, the spinsterhood tax. Yes, that's a real thing. In 1377, England introduced a tax on perpetual virgins, an annual payment required from unmarried women over age 25. The tax was higher than the marriage tax. Significantly higher. The message was clear: marriage was cheaper than independence. Similar taxes appeared across Europe. France, tax de celibate, celibacy tax. German states, Jungfernsteuer, maiden tax. Italian city-states, Gabella del Zettel, spinster tax. The economic pressure was empire-wide. Weapon 3, property seizure. In many regions, unmarried women couldn't inherit property at all. A woman's inheritance passed to her nearest male relative. If she had no close male relatives, it escheated to the local lord. Court records from 1340s England document a case where a woman's father left her his estate in his will. The local lord challenged the inheritance on grounds that she was unmarried and, therefore incapable of property management. The court sided with the lord. She lost everything. Why? Because she refused to marry. Weapon 4, Employment restrictions. Guilds, the organizations controlling most medieval professions, had explicit rules about unmarried women. The Bakers' Guild of Paris, 1412, no woman may practice the trade of baker unless married to a guild member or widowed of one. The Weavers' Guild of Florence, 1427, unmarried women may work as apprentices but never as masters, and their wages shall not exceed half that of married women. Unmarried women couldn't access most professions. Those they could access paid half wages. Economic independence through work was deliberately blocked. But financial pressure was just the beginning. Social punishment was where the system got creative. The shame rituals. Communities had public rituals specifically designed to humiliate unmarried women. Chivalry, a French tradition that spread across Europe. Once a year, unmarried women over 25 were paraded through town while the community banged pots, threw rotten vegetables, and sang mocking songs. Chronicles from 1380's Burgundy describe the ritual in detail. The old maids were crowned with nettles and made to ride backwards on donkeys while the town called out their failures. This wasn't spontaneous mockery. It was organized community enforcement. The scold's bridle. In England and Scotland, communities used a torture device called the scold's bridle, or brank, on outspoken unmarried women. It was an iron cage that locked around the head with a metal plate that went inside the mouth, pressing down the tongue. Women were forced to wear it in public for hours or days. The crime. Being unmarried and too forward in speech. Translation: refusing to be quiet about not wanting to marry. Museum records show these devices were used into the 17th century specifically on unmarried women who challenged authority. The exclusion. Unmarried women over 25 were systematically excluded from social life, banned from certain church services. Forbidden from attending weddings. Excluded from female social groups. Prevented from being godmothers. Barred from community festivals. In 1390s Germany, town ordinances explicitly banned unmarried women from wearing certain colors, red, purple, gold, and fabrics, silk, velvet. The reasoning in the ordinance, as they have refused the marriage state, they shall not display the markers of female virtue. You could be fined for wearing the wrong color while unmarried. The witchcraft accusations. Here's the darkest part: unmarried women were disproportionately accused of witchcraft. Statistical analysis of European witch trial records, 1400 to 1700, shows unmarried women were 3.4 times more likely to be accused than married women. Refusal of marriage appears in 23% of accusation documents. Age 40+ unmarried women were the highest risk category. The stereotype of the old spinster witch wasn't folklore. It was a social control mechanism. If you reached 40 unmarried, you might be accused of witchcraft just for that. And witch trials had one common outcome. Refusing marriage could literally get you killed. But some women found ways around the system. And their strategies reveal how carefully they had to navigate the legal and social traps. Strategy 1: the delayed marriage. Some women agreed to marriage but manipulated the betrothal system. Medieval marriage had multiple stages: betrothal, legally binding contract. Bans, public announcement, 3 weeks minimum. Church ceremony. Consummation, legal completion. A woman could get stuck at stage 1 or 2 indefinitely. Court records from 1360s England document women who were perpetually betrothed, legally engaged for years, sometimes decades, never actually marrying. How? By accepting a betrothal to someone who lived far away, or was frequently traveling, or was already married waiting for annulment, or who was willing to participate in the delay for payment. As long as you were betrothed, you couldn't be forced to marry someone else. But you also weren't actually married. It was a loophole. And women used it. Strategy 2, the false vow. Some women claim to have taken private religious vows. Medieval law recognized vows of chastity made directly to God. If a woman claimed such a vow, forcing her to marry would be forcing her to break a vow to God, technically heresy. The Church investigated these claims. But investigations took months or years. During that time, you couldn't be forced to marry. Some women dragged out investigations for decades by claiming spiritual experiences that required extended discernment. Was it fraud? Absolutely. Did it work? Often enough that church councils repeatedly warned about false vocations to avoid marriage. Strategy 3, the medical claim. Some women claimed medical conditions that made marriage impossible. Medieval medicine believed certain conditions made women unsuitable for marriage: excessive coldness of the womb, infertility, wandering womb, hysteria, sacred illness, epilepsy. Getting a sympathetic physician to document such a condition could exempt you from marriage pressure. Was it real? Sometimes. Was it sometimes fabricated? Court records suggest yes. The point is, women found every possible loophole in a system designed to give them no options. But the most successful resistance strategy was collective, the Beguines. Starting in the 13th century, women across Northern Europe created an alternative, semi-religious communities that didn't require formal vows. How the Beguines worked. Unlike convents, Beguine communities didn't require permanent vows, you could leave. Didn't require giving all property to the church, you kept your wealth. Didn't require papal approval to form, communities could start spontaneously. Allowed women to work and earn income. Permitted women to live independently while claiming religious exemption from marriage. It was brilliant. By claiming to be religious women, without being nuns, they avoided both marriage pressure and convent restrictions. The scale. By 1300, there were over 2,000 Beguine communities in the Low Countries alone. Some housed hundreds of women. The Groot Beginhof in Leuven, Belgium, housed over 1,000 women. It was essentially a women-only town within the city. These weren't poor women with no options. Many were wealthy. They chose Beguine life over marriage because it offered more freedom. What they did. Beguines worked. They ran businesses. They practiced medicine. They taught. They wrote theological texts. They brewed beer. They managed real estate. The Beguines of Ghent controlled over 40% of the city's textile production by 1320. They created economic power outside male control. The backlash. Predictably, the church and secular authorities tried to shut them down. In 1311, the Council of Vienne condemned the Beguines as heretical and ordered their dissolution. The charges? living in a manner contrary to the natural state of women and claiming religious status without proper male supervision. Translation: women living independently and we can't control them. But the Beguines survived by adapting. They claimed closer ties to established religious orders. They accepted more church oversight. They made themselves harder to eliminate. Many Beguine communities survived into the 20th century. A few still exist today. They proved women could create alternatives, even in medieval society. But resistance had costs. And some women paid with everything. The case of Marjorie Kemp, 1373 to 1438. Remember her from the opening? Here's what actually happened. Marjorie refused her father's arranged marriage. She wanted to dedicate her life to religious study and pilgrimage. Her family's response declared her mentally unstable, placed her under guardianship, forced her into the marriage anyway. She married, had 14 children, and spent 20 years trying to escape. Finally, at age 40, she negotiated a deal with her husband. She could live separately and pursue religious life if she paid off all his debts. She spent the next decade working, begging, and borrowing to pay his debts. At age 50, she finally gained her freedom. But here's the remarkable part: she dictated a book about her experiences, one of the first autobiographies in English. The Book of Marjorie Kemp survives today. And in it, she describes the 30-year battle to gain the independence she wanted at age 20. The case of Christine de Pizan, 1364 to 1430. Christine's story was different. She married young, but her husband died when she was 25, leaving her with 3 children and debts. As a widow, she had legal independence. But widows were under enormous pressure to remarry. Christine refused. She wanted to support herself through writing. Her family, her husband's family, the court, all pressured her to remarry. Suitors were suggested with increasing insistence. Her strategy, she wrote constantly. She became so productive, so publicly successful as a writer that remarrying would have been seen as abandoning her calling. She turned writing into her protection against forced remarriage. But the cost? She describes living in constant fear that her success would be taken as evidence of unwomanly ambition and used against her. Success made her vulnerable. But it also made her valuable enough to resist. The case of countless unknown women. For every Marjorie or Christine whose name survived, thousands didn't. Court records are full of nameless women. A woman of Rouen, age 42, fined for refusing marriage proposals 3 times in 1 year. An unnamed maiden of Florence, declared ward of the state for persistent refusal of suitable matches. 3 women of Norwich, banned from the market for setting a bad example to young girls by remaining unmarried. Most women who resisted didn't leave books. They left court fines, tax records, punishment documents. Evidence of resistance. Evidence of cost. But some women beat the system. And understanding how reveals what it took to win. Strategy, extreme wealth. Some women were rich enough to buy independence. Lady Margaret Beaufort, 1443 to 1509, married 3 times by age 17, widowed twice, divorced once. After her 3rd husband's death, she took a vow of chastity, with papal approval. Why did the Pope approve? Because she was the mother of the future King Henry VII and controlled vast wealth. Money bought her the right to refuse further marriages. She spent the rest of her life managing her estates, funding universities, and wielding political power. But notice, she had to be the mother of a king to get that freedom. Strategy, extreme holiness. Some women became so holy that forcing them to marry would be scandalous. Catherine of Siena, 1347–1380, resisted marriage by cutting off all her hair, destroying her marriageability. Claiming divine visions, making her untouchable. Joining the Dominican Third Order, religious protection without full nun status. Becoming so publicly recognized as a mystic that forcing marriage would damage the Church's reputation. She turned holiness into armor against marriage pressure. But notice, she had to become a saint to stay unmarried. Strategy, extreme usefulness. Some women made themselves too valuable to waste on marriage. Hildegard of Bingen, 1098–1179, became abbess of her convent at age 38. She advised popes and emperors, making her politically valuable. Wrote scientific and medical texts, making her intellectually valuable. Composed music and founded monasteries, making her culturally valuable. She was so useful that powerful men protected her independence. But notice, she had to become one of the most accomplished people of her century to stay unmarried. The pattern is clear: to beat the marriage system, you had to be exceptional. Extraordinarily wealthy, extraordinarily holy, or extraordinarily useful. Average women couldn't win. Only exceptional ones. The punishment of unmarried women wasn't about morality. It was about control. Medieval society needed women to marry because marriage was the mechanism through which women were controlled. Think about what marriage did: transferred a woman's property to a man. Gave a man legal authority over her. Made her economically dependent. Tied her to family alliances. Made her produce the next generation. Kept her under male supervision. A woman who refused marriage was a woman who couldn't be controlled through the standard mechanism. That's why the punishments were so systematic. The system needed everyone to participate. Exceptions threatened the entire structure. The pressure had to be total. That's why you see financial pressure, taxes, property seizure, employment restrictions. Legal pressure, loss of legal rights, perpetual minor status. Social pressure, shame rituals, exclusion, mockery. Religious pressure, vow requirements, witchcraft accusations. Physical pressure, scolds bridals, forced marriages, guardianships. Every aspect of life designed to make unmarried existence impossible. Because if women could live well without marrying, why would anyone marry? And if women stopped marrying, the entire social, economic, and political system would collapse. The system required belief. But here's the fascinating part: the system only worked if everyone believed it was natural. That's why unmarried women were called unnatural. Why refusing marriage was denying your nature. Why independence was contrary to the female condition. If refusing marriage is unnatural, then forcing marriage isn't oppression, it's helping women achieve their natural state. The ideology justified the system. And the punishment of unmarried women reinforced the ideology. This is how systems of control maintain themselves, by making resistance seem like mental illness, moral failure, or supernatural evil. The scold's bridle. The witchcraft accusations. The wandering womb diagnosis. All ways of saying, if you refuse to participate, you're sick, evil, or insane. Not oppressed. Just wrong. The punishment of unmarried women didn't end with the Middle Ages. 18th to 19th century. The spinster stigma intensified. Unmarried women were depicted in literature and culture as pathetic, failed to achieve womanhood. Dangerous, potentially corrupting young women. Mentally unstable, obviously something wrong with them. Laws preventing unmarried women from owning property until late 1800s in many places. Working in certain professions. Living independently, without male guardian approval. Traveling alone. 20th century. Even into the 1900s, U.S. states had laws allowing forced commitment of wayward, unmarried women to institutions. Employment discrimination against unmarried women was legal and common. Confirmed bachelorette was clinical diagnosis in some medical texts. Social pressure to marry remained intense. 21st century. The mechanisms evolved but the pattern continues. Women who don't marry face biological clock, pressure, medical framing of urgency. Commitment-phobic labels, psychological diagnosis. Social questioning, why are you still single? Economic penalties, single tax, insurance rates, housing discrimination. Cultural representation as tragic or flawed. The language changed from unnatural to unhealthy. From legal punishment to social pressure. But the core message remains, female independence from partnership is aberrant and should be corrected. Understanding how medieval society punished unmarried women reveals something crucial. The intensity of punishment reveals how threatening women's independence actually was. They didn't create elaborate legal structures, financial penalties, social rituals, and physical punishments because unmarried women were pitiable failures. They created all that because unmarried women were dangerous successes. The Beguines proved it. 2,000 communities of women living independently, working, creating wealth, building power outside male control. They had to be condemned as heretics. Because they were too successful. Marjorie Kemp spent 30 years fighting for the independence she wanted. That's not the behavior of someone accepting a natural role. That's resistance. Christine de Pizan wrote herself into protection against forced remarriage. That's not failure. That's strategy. The medieval system threw everything at women who refused marriage. Financial ruin. Legal incapacity. Social exile. Torture devices. Witchcraft accusations. And still, some women refused. The Beguines. The perpetually betrothed. The false vow takers. The women who found every loophole, used every strategy, paid every cost. Because the alternative, surrendering autonomy, was worse than the punishment. Pause. Today, we look at medieval punishments of unmarried women and think, that was a long time ago. We've evolved. But the core question hasn't changed. What happens to women who refuse the life society expects them to live? Medieval society answered with legal codes, financial weapons, social exile, and physical punishment. Modern society answers with social pressure, economic penalty, medical pathologization, and cultural stigma. The mechanisms evolved. The question remains. Subscribe if you believe we need to understand how systems of control actually work, through the people who resisted them. Leave a comment. What would medieval women think about how society treats unmarried women today? Because here's the truth, every woman who refused marriage in the Middle Ages, who faced fines, taxes, exclusion, accusations, torture, and still said no, was fighting for something we still don't fully have. The right to exist outside the structures designed to control us. Some of them won. Most paid terrible costs. But they all proved the same thing: independence is possible. That's why they had to be punished so severely. Because their existence proved the system was optional. And that made them the most dangerous women in medieval society.